The first clue that something was wrong wasn't a scream or a footprint, it was the smell of wet wool and milk, sharp as a wound in the clean, freezing air. It hit Cyrus where the trail forked at the base of the Devil's Tooth, a granite spire that usually acted as a sundial for the few souls brave or foolish enough to winter in this stretch of the Montana high plains. For 5 days, the only scent he'd registered was pine smoke clinging to his collar and the metallic tang of his own stale breath. He stopped his bay gelding, Barnaby, who blew a heavy plume of white vapor and shifted his weight on the ice-crusted snow. Cyrus pulled his neckerchief higher over his beard. The smell was wrong. Wrong and too close. He was heading for the Black Elk settlement, 30 miles off, carrying a lockbox for a railroad trustee. The settlement was barely a dozen shacks huddled near a defunct silver mine, but it had a warm stove and a bottle of rye. He kicked Barnaby into a slow walk toward the scent. It led him off trail to an abandoned line shack, a relic from the last bad winter of '88, roof half collapsed, door hanging off its hinges like a broken jaw. The snow around it was undisturbed, pure and blindingly white, except for a set of deep, uneven depressions leading from the door to the shadows beneath a stand of juniper. Cyrus dismounted, the crunch of his boots sounding deafening. He drew the big iron from his holster and pushed the door wider. Inside, the light was gray and thin. A narrow cot, a rusted bucket, and a pile of rags, the usual detritus of a forgotten trapper. But on the dirt floor, near the cold hearth, was a child's rag doll. Crude, stitched from flour sacking, with button eyes. It was damp to the touch, and it was warm. Cyrus stood dead still. A grown man alone in a blizzard might be confused for a ghost, but a child's toy was a tether to the living, and no one lived within 50 miles. He turned his head slowly, scanning the perimeter. His eyes caught the corner of the room, behind the collapsed stovepipe. A stack of firewood. He walked over, his heavy coat rustling like dry leaves. The wood wasn't wood. It was a neat stack of 6 logs, each one about the length of a man's forearm, white and ridged like bleached bone. He stared at the pieces, the smell of milk and wet wool now overwhelming, mixing with something else, the faint, clean scent of lye soap. He didn't touch them. He didn't need to. He knew what a femur looked like. He knew the way a hip joint ended in a smooth, polished ball. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the outside air, that these were not animal bones. They had been deliberately stacked. He backed out of the shack, the snow squeaking under his heels, his breath catching in his throat. Cyrus rode hard, the lockbox thumping against his thigh, the ghost smell of wet wool clinging to his memory. He didn't stop until the gray horizon line of the plains finally broke into the skeletal architecture of Black Elk. The town was quieter than usual. Not silent, a few dogs barked, but subdued. No chimney smoke. He tied Barnaby outside the general store, the only place with a lamp lit. He found Elias Thorne, the store owner, behind the counter, polishing a rifle he didn't need. Thorne was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same hard rock as the mountains, stubborn, weathered, and suspicious of anything softer than raw whiskey. "Thorne," Cyrus said, his voice clipped. "The trustee expecting this?" He dropped the iron box onto the counter. Thorne didn't look at the box. He didn't look at Cyrus. He kept running the oil rag over the rifle barrel. "You're late." His voice was a flat rasp. "Weather was bad. Hit a line shack up near the tooth. Found something." Thorne finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were pale blue, narrowed by a lifetime of squinting at the sun, and they held an unsettling placidity. "Folks are gone, Cyrus," Thorne said. "Gone where?" "There's a blizzard coming. They don't leave this time of year." "They left." Thorne rested the rifle on the counter. "Headed south. Said they were tired of the cold. Said they'd had enough of the thaw-eaters." The term was new. It felt heavy and old, like a stone from a forgotten burial ground. "What in the hell are you talking about, Thorne?" "There was a rag doll in the shack." Warm. And bones. Human bones, stacked like firewood. Thorn leaned forward, his elbows resting beside the rifle. He didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. The first freeze of November was a false one, Cyrus. That's what they say. The winter started, but then the air, it changed. The cold kept coming, but the snow turned soft in places. The deep, hard snow, that's your friend. It locks the ground, locks the world. But when it softens, when it melts a little on the surface, even when the temperature ain't above zero, that's when things come up for air. Cyrus felt the sweat freezing on his temples. Who left? Everyone but me. And the preacher. Thorn nodded toward the back of the store. He's praying in the storeroom. Praying for the ground to harden up proper. And you? You didn't go with them. Thorn finally reached for the lockbox, sliding it toward him. He looked at Cyrus, a grim, humorless smile pulling at his lips. I got no place else to be, Cyrus. And I got this. He patted the rifle. Some secrets are best buried under a hard freeze. But when the ground's soft, well, you just gotta know how to clean up the mess when it surfaces. A sudden, sharp sound came from the street, a rhythmic thump drag, like a wounded animal struggling through the snow. Thorn's head snapped up. He went utterly still, every muscle tensed. Shut the lights, Cyrus. Now. Cyrus fumbled for the lantern wick, plunging the store into near total darkness, only the faint gray light from the window remaining. The thump drag came closer, stopping right outside the window. Then a new sound, a slow, liquid scrape against the wooden siding, like something dragging a wet tongue along the wall. Cyrus held his breath, his eyes fixed on Thorn. In the gloom, the storekeeper's pale eyes reflected the thin light, and the placidity was gone. Now, they were wide with a terror that was not new, but old and accustomed. Thorn whispered, a sound like dry dust, they ain't ghosts, Cyrus. They're just hungry for the light that comes after the thaw. They only eat what the ground gives up. He raised the rifle slowly, aiming at a spot low on the wall, near the floor. They leave the bones, you see. They stack them. Like thanks. Like a promise. A shadow fell across the windowpane, too wide for a man, too low for a beast. It moved with a slow, dreadful deliberation. The scraping stopped. The silence returned, deeper and heavier than the snow itself. Then, a sound came from above the window, near the roofline. A faint, sickening wet sound, followed by a drip. 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 It was melting snow, but the sound felt wrong, too fast, too warm. Thorn didn't hesitate. He fired. The blast was deafening, the muzzle flash blinding. A wet, tearing shriek followed the shot, a sound that had no animal analog, a high, rattling choke that faded almost instantly into the vast, absorbing silence of the winter night. Thrown rifle, the stench of gunpowder bitter in the air. They learn quick, you know, he murmured, reloading with practiced ease. They only come out when the surface snow is soft enough to walk on, but not too soft. Like they're waiting for the edge. He looked directly at Cyrus, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. You're stuck, Cyrus. That snow ain't safe now. Stay the night. We'll pray for a hard, killing freeze by morning. Only thing that settles, M. Cyrus didn't answer. He looked out the window. The thin gray light was enough to see the deep, uneven depressions in the snow, leading away from the store. And just below the window, where the shot had been fired, was a dark, spreading stain on the white surface, a slick of liquid that didn't look red, but clear, oily, and shimmering faintly in the dark, like melted ice mixed with old cream. He glanced back at Thorn, who was already running a clean patch down the barrel of his rifle, preparing it again for the night. The smell of wet wool and milk, sharp and sickeningly clean, was now faint, overpowered by the gunpowder, but Cyrus knew it would return with the silence. He was alone with a man who had stacked human bones and knew how to shoot what came to collect them. He reached down, his fingers finding the cool, reassuring grip of his own big iron. The thaw had stopped. The cold was deepening. He waited, listening to the drip, drip, drip of the melting fluid outside, and felt the immense, terrifying solitude of the plains descend, no longer a barrier, but a vast, cold expanse of soft, forgiving ground. Second story. The first unsettling thing about the snow line was that the snow never sounded right. It should have been a soft, dead quiet, a blanket muffling the world. But out on the high plains between the sawtooths and the bitterroot, the snow hummed. It was a high, nearly subsonic whine that vibrated through the frozen ground, a sound more felt in the teeth than heard with the ear. It was the sound of millions of microscopic ice crystals catching the constant, dry wind, and it made the silence feel crowded. Marshall, a man whose face had been weathered into the color and texture of old saddle leather, stopped the sled and squinted into the white glare. He didn't bother shading his eyes, the light was already flat and dim, like looking at the world through a sheet of milky glass. "Too far out, Zeke," Marshall said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried past the sled's runners. He didn't turn to the man huddled in the buffalo robes behind him. "Sun's been below the ridge for 2 hours, but we ain't seen a drift shaped like anything but a lie." Zeke, younger, with eyes that still held a flicker of doubt the winter hadn't burned out, shifted uncomfortably. He was holding an old Henry rifle, its barrel already rimmed with frost. "The claim's gotta be here. Three Brothers Creek." We followed the directions. The directions were written by a dying man selling a hole in the ground, Marshall countered. "Look around, son. We've crossed 3 dry gulches in the last hour. There are no creeks, only scars. And that's what worries me." He pointed a mittened hand ahead. The plain was a featureless expanse of white, but about a quarter-mile off, a cluster of stones stood against the backdrop. They weren't boulders, they were too regular, too aligned. They looked like the broken foundations of a small, square building, maybe a one-room cabin, completely swallowed by drifts except for the top stones. The unsettling part wasn't the ruin. It was the smoke. A thin, gray column, almost invisible against the bruised sky, rose from the center of the ruins. It didn't waft or billow. It rose straight up, as clean and still as a line drawn with a ruler, then vanished 100 feet above, shredded by the incessant wind. "Nobody lives out here," Zeke whispered. "Not this time of year. Not since '89. "Right," Marshall agreed, pulling his heavy fur collar higher. His breath misted and immediately froze on the fringes. "And nobody burns anything out here. Not with the cold this deep. It's too expensive, too much labor to chop and haul. Not unless they're cooking or keeping a corpse soft enough to dig a hole for." He didn't mention the smell. Not wood smoke. Something sweet, metallic, and vaguely like burnt hair carried on the unnaturally still air near the ground. Marshall left the sled and started walking toward the ruins. He didn't draw his sidearm. He knew enough about the high country to know that anyone who could be out here didn't need a warning shot to kill you. As he got closer, the smoke thinned and then simply stopped. The smell intensified, sickeningly sweet now, like old blood and molasses. The only sound was the omnipresent, high-pitched hum of the snow line, and the crunch of Marshall's boots. He reached the ruin. It wasn't a cabin. It was a corral, small and crude, built of fieldstone and now choked with snow. The smoke hadn't come from a chimney. It had come from a fire pit right in the middle of the corral. And in the pit, the stones were still hot. There were ashes, not of wood, but of bone, small, fragmented pieces, pale and slick, mixed with a scattering of blackened metal buttons and what looked sickeningly like a boot heel. But what stopped Marshall cold, making the blood in his veins feel like liquid mercury, was the detail in the snow around the fire pit. There were footprints. Dozens of them. Deep, uneven prints of bare human feet, all leading into the corral, milling around the fire, and then, all leading away, disappearing into the featureless white toward the frozen mountains to the west. Marshall looked at the print nearest him. It was a massive impression, flat and splayed. It was a man's foot, unshod, and it was perfectly clean, as if the owner had been standing on warm stone, not 2 feet away from the pit full of human ash, before walking off into a $20 below zero wasteland. Marshall. What is it? Zeke's voice was strained, amplified by the dead air. Marshall didn't answer. He turned and looked toward the looming mountains. The sun was gone now, and the blue shadows were turning deep violet, then black. He realized the humming had stopped. The wind had dropped completely. The silence was absolute, a crushing pressure. And the cold, it was a sudden, bone-aching spike, the cold of deep space. And then he saw it. On the highest, most distant ridge, where the last light bled from the sky, a line of dark shapes stood silhouetted. Too tall for deer. Too many for wolf. They weren't moving, just standing, perfectly still, watching the ruin. Marshall's eyes narrowed. He looked at the shapes, and the shapes looked back. They weren't wearing coats. They looked like men, but stretched, elongated by the final, dying light, naked, or perhaps wearing only skin. They were too far to count, but there were enough of them that the ridge looked like the teeth of a massive, frozen beast. Zeke, Marshall hissed, turning back to the sled, his breath clouding over the metallic tang of the ash pit. We don't care about the claim. We don't care about the gold. Get that rifle up and turn the sled west. We follow the tracks. Now. West. Into the mountains. We'll freeze. We stay here, we don't, Marshall said, his eyes hard and empty. That fire didn't burn a man to keep a corpse soft. It burned a man because something was hungry enough to stop being cold. He mounted the sled, yanked the reins, and they moved, the sled runners singing a painful shriek on the hard snow, heading directly into the mountains where the dark, motionless figures waited. They couldn't go back, the plains felt too wide, too open now. They had seen the fire. They had seen the silence. And Marshall knew the one unforgivable sin on the frontier wasn't stealing or murder, it was seeing a secret the land didn't want you to keep. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed them completely was the largest shape on the ridge. It shifted, not walking, but simply bending over, its elongated form dissolving into the snow, and when it rose again a moment later, it was noticeably closer. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was simply traveling the snow line, and it was watching them go. Marshall drove the horses harder, away from the tracks of the newly burned, and toward the cold, silent things that had left no prints at all. Third story. The air was so cold it had a scent, iron and granite dust, sharp in the back of the throat. Elias didn't mind the cold. He minded the quiet. He was sitting 20 feet above the frozen bed of the Cheyenne River, his breath making a continuous, white cloud under the skeletal branches of a cottonwood. His rifle, a Winchester 73 with a dark, polished patina, was across his lap. He hadn't fired it in 3 days. He hadn't seen anything worth shooting in 4. The unease didn't come from the isolation, Elias had courted isolation his whole life. It came from the way the snow fell. It wasn't drifting, it was coating. Every branch, every fence post, every stone had an impossibly thick, even cap, like plaster, unmarred by wind. It made the world look less like a prairie and more like a poorly rendered photograph. Everything was static, unnatural. The worst part was what happened 3 days ago, just outside the dying rail town of High Crossing. Elias had been hired to find a man named Silas, a failed prospector who owed the bank in Laramie 5 years of interest and a pound of flesh. Silas's horse was found, starved and half-buried, 10 miles west of town. Silas himself was gone, but his camp was still there, huddled against a shale outcropping. And in that camp, the only sign of Silas was a small, perfectly preserved stack of firewood. It was neatly split, enough for 3 or 4 nights, stacked under a tarp, completely dry. But the campfire pit beside it was full of snow. Silas had frozen to death, or walked away to freeze, with a warm fire within reach. It made no sense. Elias, who had seen men do terrible, illogical things for gold, liquor, or desperation, could not fathom a man refusing heat in a Wyoming winter. Now, he was hunkered down, watching the old O'Malley Ranch, a gray, derelict compound 3 miles from High Crossing. The ranch had been abandoned for 30 years, since the whole family vanished one October night. It was known bad ground, but the tracks Elias had been following, small, clean boot prints, too new for the ranch to be empty, led straight to the back stable door. The cold was burrowing into him, despite the layers of wool and hide. He shifted, lifting the rifle. "Silas," Elias muttered, testing the name on the cold air. A sound returned. Not an echo, not the wind. It was a single, brittle crack of dry wood, coming from the main house. Elias waited, silent. In a world this cold, wood didn't just crack under thermal stress, it needed to be handled, or put under load. A minute passed. Then another. The perfect snow lay unbroken over the compound. Crack. This time, Elias was certain. It came from the stable, 20 yards closer. It sounded like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. But the floorboards in the O'Malley stable had rotted out and been buried under dirt years ago. Elias slid down the frozen riverbank, landing silently in the dead grass. He moved toward the stable wall, keeping low. The structure was just stone and sagging lumber, its roof like a crushed hat. He reached the window frame, no glass, just a gaping hole of blackness. He pressed his face close to the rough stone, straining his eyes. The interior was deep shadow, but Elias's eyes were good, and he had the flat, dim light of a high-altitude winter afternoon to help. The stable was empty. No horses, no Silas, no equipment. Just a heavy layer of snow covering the dirt floor. Then he saw the hay pile. In the far corner, a bale of old, blackened hay was stacked against the wall. And on top of the hay, someone had placed 3 objects, arranged in a neat triangle. A child's small, wooden doll, naked and stiff. A single, shiny copper penny from the 1870s. A human tooth, clean and bleached white. Elias felt the dread tighten in his chest. This wasn't a desperate man. This was a ceremony. He saw the footprints again, leading to the hay and then stopping. They didn't lead away. Then, from the center of the stable, from the middle of the undisturbed snow, came a tiny, muffled sound. It was a slow, wet-sucking noise. Elias recoiled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He leveled the rifle at the spot in the snow. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice a raw explosion in the stillness. The sucking stopped. The silence resumed, but now it was thick, weighted, like wet wool pressed against his ears. Elias held his breath. He was certain there was someone in the stable. But he was just as certain there was no place to hide. He took a careful step backward, intending to circle the building and reach the main door. That's when he smelled it, sharp, clean, and horribly potent. Ozone. The smell of a freshly struck match, or high-voltage lightning discharge. It was coming from the ground, right beneath his boots. He looked down. He was standing on a patch of dirt the size of a wagon wheel, not snow. It was a perfect, dark circle, right outside the stable wall, like a black eye in the white world. The ground was slightly warm. And running across the dirt, barely visible, were 2 parallel tracks, thin, sharp lines, about 6 inches apart, like something had been dragged. Not heavy. Just, pulled. He followed the tracks with his eyes. They led not into the stable, but up the stone wall. Elias slowly raised his gaze. The tracks went up the rough-hewn granite, over the crumbling mortar, to the roofline, and then disappeared over the top. He heard the suck again, closer now, directly overhead. And then another, shorter sound, a thin, dry scrape, like a fingernail across slate. The dread became panic. Elias didn't look up. He sprinted away from the wall, across the yard, toward the ranch house. The snow that had been so perfectly quiet under his feet before now felt like running through shattered glass. He slammed the main house door open, stumbling into the parlor. The house was colder inside than out. 1,000 cobwebs draped like dead silk in the massive, frozen space. He spun, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, breathing hard. The sucking and scraping had stopped the moment he entered the house. He stood in the oppressive dark, the smell of dust and extreme cold filling his nose. He should leave. He should ride until he reached the Continental Divide and never look back. But he was a man of the frontier. He had a job, and he needed to see what he was dealing with, if only to ride the other way with a clear conscience. He pushed off the door and crossed the room, his boots kicking up clouds of dry plaster dust. He headed toward the kitchen, toward the well shaft that ran through the foundation. He found it, covered with a heavy, round iron lid. The lid had been moved, just a fraction of an inch. A sliver of blackness showed along the rim. And from that sliver of blackness came a single, short, almost inaudible sound. It was a chuckle. It was high, breathy, and utterly without mirth. It was the sound a child might make when playing a terrible trick. Elias drew his Colt revolver and knelt, pressing his ear to the cold iron lid. The ozone smell was powerful here, and he could feel the faint warmth radiating from the metal. The chuckle came again. And this time, it was followed by the clear, articulate sound of a human voice, whispering from deep in the shaft. "You left the fire, Silas. Didn't you?" The chilling part wasn't the voice. It was the absolute, agonizing certainty in Elias's mind that the well shaft, sealed by 50 feet of frozen earth, could not possibly echo the outside world. He stood up, his hands shaking. He didn't drop the gun. He simply turned, leaving the warm-smelling well and the whispering hole behind him. He walked to the front door, pulled it open, and stepped back into the perfect, paralyzing cold. The tracks were gone. The pristine snow of the O'Malley Ranch was now completely unmarked, except for the path he had just made. The sun had dipped below the ridge, leaving the sky the color of old bruises. As he mounted his horse, Elias finally looked up at the main house. The single, untouched pane of glass in the attic window caught the last light. And in that window, staring out, was a figure. It wasn't Silas. It was too tall, too thin, and it wore only a gray, threadbare blanket. Its face was a pale oval, expressionless. It stood utterly still, framed by the dust and the dark. Elias dug his heels into his horse's flank and rode, not toward High Crossing, but east, away from the mountains, away from the dry hum of the high plains, and away from the unspeakable silence of the cold. He didn't look back until he could no longer see the O'Malley Ranch. When he finally did, the attic window was still a dark, square eye in the distance. But the figure was gone. Instead, a thin column of pure white smoke rose from the top of the house. It was not fire. It was too cold, too dense. It was the sight of 1,000 perfect, heavy snow caps, all sliding off the roof in unison, dropping soundlessly to the ground, revealing the black shingles beneath. The house was not clearing itself of snow. It was simply refusing the weight of it. Elias rode until morning, the rifle heavy in his hands, never forgetting the smell of ozone and warm earth in the bitter cold. He thought of the penny, the tooth, and the child's doll left as a perfect offering. And he realized that Silas hadn't refused the fire. He had been asked to leave it. And when he did, he paid the toll not with his life, but with his heat, leaving him exposed to the unspeakable thing that hated the quiet of the snow.